Hello everyone, this video is going to be about a wither skeleton farm that I designed, and I wanted to go ahead and start it off by just showing the rates so that anybody watching can know whether this is something that even interests them. So first of all though, what this is a single crossroad, single dimension, wither skeleton only fortress farm. That's a mouthful, but what it means is basically it only uses one crossroad out of a nether fortress bounding box, which there will be more information on that later if you don't know what that is. And it also means it only uses one dimension, so we don't send the wither skeletons to the overworld. So that means that this will work on servers as long as you have a free mob cap. Now, looking at the rates, you can see that we get something around 550 skulls per hour. I've run this farm for over 20 hours, although just looking at this 5-hour run on my tick warp, if we look right here we can see we have a total of actually 570, but because we're working with a relatively low drop chance, the amount of rates from these farms can vary pretty greatly by RNG. So if we look at things like the bones and the coal though, that's a little bit more consistent, where you get between 25 and 27,000 per hour, and where the coal where you get around 17 to 20,000 per hour. So in this instance we have 18,800 per hour, for example. So what this means is that as far as what this is, it's very fast. Remember, this only uses one crossroad, so it's half the spawning spaces of most other farms of this type. So I'm going to start off with the basics of the way these actually work. That way if you're looking to change this yourself, or you want to just design your own entire one, you'll have the mechanics to be able to do so. So the first thing is going to be about the basic mob spawning mechanics, and this applies for basically any mob farm. So the two big ones are spawning spaces and the mob cap. So essentially there's a cap on all mobs of different types for how many can exist at the same time, and once that number is reached, no more will spawn naturally. So what that means is if, for example, we have 70 of these guys alive at the same time, more will not spawn until some of them die or despawn. Now if we look at this tab menu provided by Carpet Mod, we can see there are only 15 alive right now. So basically what this means is that if you have 70 mobs in the world, no more will spawn. That's why it's important to spawn proof outside your farm, or be in a location where only the mobs can spawn in your farm. On top of this, there's also an invisible sphere around the player which determines where mobs can spawn. So essentially, there is a 24 block radius around the player in which no mobs are able to spawn whatsoever. Then there is a 32 block radius around the player where mobs cannot despawn, but in between the 24 and 32, they can spawn. And lastly, there's a 128 block radius sphere around the player where mobs can both spawn and despawn. Now they can only despawn between the 32 and the 128. So to put that visually, you can kind of see the walls of the area I cleared out for the creative part of this farm. That is 128 block radius. It's a 256 by 256 square area. So it's a really massive area. Now we're going to move on to some of the more fortress specific mechanics. So basically this is going to be how you'll get on with the wither skeleton part of mob farms. So one thing to note is that the way that fortresses work is that they have their own unique set of mobs which can spawn inside them, and the game has a specific way of choosing what is a fortress and what isn't. Now Masa actually has a mod which gives us an overlay called Mini HUD, where we can essentially see the bounding boxes that determine where the fortress is as far as the game considers it. So if we turn them on here, you'll see a bunch of red boxes. So this is basically where the fortress was. Now you'll notice there's two types of boxes. There's this giant one going around the entire thing, and then there's all these little ones that look like the buildings in the fortress itself. So these actually behave differently. You have the outer bounding box, which is the massive rectangle around everything, and the inner bounding box, which is where the buildings were specifically. And again, they behave differently. So the difference is that within an inner bounding box structure, mobs can spawn on top of any block, the fortress mobs, and it will be only the fortress mobs. It won't be determined by the biome. And on the outer bounding box, these fortress mobs will only be able to spawn if they are on nether brick. Now, the main thing that this means for our farm here is that you cannot put wither roses on nether brick, and I'll explain why we use wither roses shortly. So there are actually 4 different kinds of mobs which can spawn inside the fortress, and this includes the blaze, the zombie pigman, the magma cube, and of course the wither skeleton. So the goal of this farm is to make it so that we only have wither skeletons spawning. Now the way that we can do that is using these wither roses on the floor. Essentially, these things will hurt any mobs that step in them, so the mobs don't want to spawn inside them. But they don't hurt the wither skeletons, so they are able to spawn inside them. So this basically means that all of these platforms will only spawn wither skeletons and it won't spawn anything else. They won't even have to spend time dying, they just won't ever exist, which is super handy. Now there's one more mechanic, and part of this is fortress specific, but part of it is also for general mob farms, and that is the pack spawning. So pack spawning in general is basically using non-spawnable blocks around the spawning platform to make the mobs spawn in packs of 4 instead of groups of 1. The reason this works is that whenever Minecraft tries to spawn a mob, it will try to spawn it in a pack. It's called a pack attempt. And basically, the more blocks around where it's trying to spawn, the more times it will try to make the pack bigger. Now the way we utilize this in farms is again using non-spawnable blocks. That way the entire pack still spawns in the spawnable blocks on the farm basically, but the non-spawnable blocks will still allow the packs to be bigger. However, in a fortress it can be slightly different. So if we remember, the mobs in the outer bounding box can only spawn on nether bricks, right? Now the thing about pack spawning is the mobs have to believe they'll be able to spawn on it. So in a fortress specifically, that means the pack spawning has to be made out of nether bricks. But the problem is that that's spawnable, so it will make wither skeletons farther away from the piglin outside of their range, which I'll cover soon. And it will also spawn the other fortress mobs because we won't be able to put wither roses on them. So what we can do is apply something like a carpet or something else to spawn proof over them, even slabs, and it will make it so they can't be spawned on, but they will increase the pack sizes. And you can see just watching the farm in the background that most of the time more than one wither skeleton will spawn at once here. Now, the final thing that I want to mention about the way that the fortresses work is going to be actually related to the biome it's in. So, I'm sure a lot of people have heard that a soul sand valley is the best biome for a nether fortress, but if you aren't aware why, it is because of a mechanic known as spawning potential. Basically, what this means is that outside of the fortress mobs, the mobs are not able to spawn near each other. So, anytime there's a mob, for example that ghast over there, he's got a circle around him, and a fairly big circle, and no mobs can spawn near him. And when there's 2 mobs next to each other like that, the circle is like multiplicatively increased. So basically there will not be a lot of mobs flying around outside of the fortress, even if you do absolutely no spawn proofing in a soul sand valley. This is also effective in a warped forest biome. And if you really want to take the soul sand valley thing one step farther, for whatever reason, the striders, the passive mobs, will count towards this spawning potential even though they aren't even hostile mobs. So essentially, you can put striders in little pods around the area and it will completely block all of the spawns in the soul sand valley. Now, if even a little tiny bit of your despawn sphere, the big one, around where the player is going to be, touches another biome, there will be tons of mobs spawning there, and it has to be fully spawn proof the old fashioned way, which would be clicking buttons down. So the Soul Sand Valley can be an absolutely massive thing for anybody who can't afford something like a World Eater to make a perimeter. So now we're going to look at the features of this farm specifically to show off why they work, why they're effective, and why I chose them. So let's start off with the actual piglin cell here. So if you didn't know, wither skeletons and piglins don't get along, they fight each other. So what this means is that we can basically put a piglin in here and all the wither skeletons will try to murder him to death. So by making a cell like this, utilizing trapdoors and these grindstones, we can basically make a very simple drop chute that will drop the mobs down into our killing area. So when they spawn in, they see him, they want to kill him, and they think that the best way to get to him is this way. Now the reason they think that is actually this set of trapdoors, and it looks a little bit weird, but here's why it works. So we have these two, which are essentially part of the floor. Well, actually, let's go ahead and backtrack. So a mechanic between mobs is they don't actually believe in trapdoors. They simply aren't real to them. So what that means is that they think they can walk over this. And what that means is that they think they can walk through these. Essentially, all mob pathfinding can go straight through trapdoors like they aren't even there. So if we leave these open, the mobs will try to walk over it and just fall down. And these trapdoors are here for a few reasons. So this one keeps the piglin in place without blocking the wither skeleton thinking he can reach him. The one down here makes sure that there's no air block here, so the wither skeleton believes he can reach him. If this trapdoor underneath this one wasn't here, right there through the glass, this one, then essentially there would be an open block here, and the wither skeleton would say, hey wait, I can't reach him because there's no block for me to actually get to him through there. But when we put the trapdoor there, they think they can go there. And lastly, we have this one right here on top of the one on the floor. And basically, what can happen sometimes is if a wither skeleton gets pushed funny, they will get caught up on top of this trapdoor here because you can actually land on it, see, and you can just stand on it. So you put that one there, that way they aren't able to get stuck there. So that's the trapdoor setup. Now the other part of this are the grindstones. So the grindstones are basically a specific size that can allow 2 mobs to fit in at once, or more like 1.5. But basically it makes it harder for the mobs to get stuck. If we were to be using full blocks in this space instead of the grindstones, the mobs would have a harder time funneling in, and it would slow down the rates because the mobs would spend longer getting to their death. So that's why we use the grindstones here. And other than that, we just chain it down 3 times, and they go into our drop chute, the next topic of discussion. So you could see originally the drop chute is actually a 1x2, but I wanted to make it a 1x1 just for convenience, and so that it's relatively fully automatic. If you aren't using it, you'll still get loads of coal and bones. So I use this little tiny circuit here, which basically just makes it so that anytime a mob lands on it, they will just be pushed and fall into the 1x1. So now we're in the 1x1 here. So anytime a wither skeleton lands here, they will be pushed off and just go into the spot. Very convenient. We have a pretty cool storage system set up here. So you can see when the mobs drop, they land on this iron bar right here. And basically that's just a non-full block, and their items will fall off of it. But just in case they don't, we have this little piston pushing them, as well as the XP up to the player. That way we don't lose any of the items. Now after they've fallen down from there, they land in this little area, which is basically using these pistons on the side to move all the items in front of the slime block, and then launching them using the slime block and ice mechanic, and then just doing it on a second one. Now you may notice I'm using a cake here, and could be wondering why on earth I'm doing that. So the cake is actually a specific size, and there's a few things that are that size, including chests and ender chests, or even some pickles. And if you're really fancy, you could even use a dragon egg. But basically what this item does, by being slightly less than a full block, it allows all of our items to be lined up over both the hoppers and the ice. So we use this second slime arm, and it will basically push the items and make them slide along the ice at high speeds, and get picked up by all the hoppers. So when you're doing your own storage system, you can hook up these sorters to it, and it will be a super easy setup. Now another feature I wanted to show off is that aside from the clock itself, this design is entirely dustless. So this is going to be something more interesting to the more advanced players, but essentially redstone dust is pretty laggy. So the only dust I have is in the clock, which somebody who cares about removing redstone dust could just change the clock to something else. But the rest of the build is entirely using observers and rails, and it would not be hard to make this just using redstone dust if you aren't too concerned about saving an MSPT or 2 of lag. Okay, and the final mechanic down here is actually why this cactus is here. So this farm is actually fast enough to produce a decent amount of XP, and it's actually to a point that sometimes it hits the ingestion limit of the player. So if that happens for too long, eventually the XP items can build up and lag the server or your client. But by putting a cactus behind the player, it will destroy any excess ones that the player is not able to eat. So this is pretty much just a standard thing to add to any farm that produces a ton of experience. Although to be fair, this is probably optional for most places, especially if you're not doing this with perfectly optimal conditions, which most people probably won't be. So the last thing I'm going to get into are the slightly more advanced things for people looking to tweak this, or to make their own improvements, or they want to know why it is just so fast for what it is. So first of all, let's discuss why this is a single crossroad and not a double crossroad. So one of the most important mechanics in Minecraft mob spawning is essentially how fast the mobs die. So as you can see, these guys spawn in and they only have to walk like 8 blocks, and then they fall into the chute and they are quickly stabbed. So they don't get to live for very long. Now, what this means is it frees up mob cap for more mobs to spawn even sooner. Now, as you can see, this farm basically never even comes close to hitting the mob cap. So that is because they die so very quickly. Now, we could improve this by doing some minor changes to make more mobs spawn at once, or to make them spawn slightly faster, but realistically, I think this is enough for the scope of what this farm is. So the thing about making this into a double crossroad, using some of my concepts, such as the 1x1 drop chute, it would be harder to do with a second chute, because essentially you'll need a whole another set of piglins because the detection range isn't big enough. So you basically have to build this farm twice, and then somehow transport all of the wither skeletons from the second one back over to the first drop chute, which would obviously increase the lifespan of the mobs. So making this into a double crossroad farm would actually not be twice as fast, although it would be faster because it is not hitting mob cap right now. Some of the problems that we have in the farm include the item loss that you can get. So there is very, very little item loss, but there is one area where it can happen, and that is under these 2 slabs, right next to the iron bar. So I needed to put basically something that would not pick up the iron slab or the iron bar and make it connect to them. So I had to use slabs basically. Now, the slabs here still prevent most of them, but occasionally after like over an hour of the farm running, you could see an item get stuck in here. And the big problem with that is that whenever an item is on the ground, any other items of the same type that go over it will stack up with it and get stuck with it. So if you are very unlucky and you have a wither skeleton head get stuck down here, you can end up having all of them stuck that you produce for the next 5 minutes up until you get a stack of them stuck in here instead of being collected. And lastly, it would be the XP management. You could see there's a lot of XP just floating around in there, and the piston pushing it really isn't reliable for getting it to the player, and a lot of the time it'll end up just like floating around down here or doing something weird like that. See? So there could probably be a better XP management system, but I set it up like this just so that we could have the convenient storage system. And it doesn't produce enough XP to really cause lag, but if you wanted this to be a better XP farm, you could probably work on that. So I think that covers it all, and I'm just going to show like a 15-second clip of the farm just running down here. And that'll be it for the video. Thank you for watching.